Hey guys, welcome back to another episode of Narrative Dive. We are thrilled that you're back today because we are talking about a super interesting concept that science fiction nerds like myself and Angela have dove very deep into over the years, and that is the dystopian narrative. I'm Jessica Buchleitner, your resident journalist.
I'm Angela Natividad, your resident mythologist, and I'm especially excited about today's topic because, as you know, we're here to share insights about the narratives that dominate our world, and dystopia might feel like a really big one right now.
I think to a lot of people it does, and something
Yeah.
tells me that there's been a lot of requests for this kind of episode from people who are familiar with the matter that know we are producing this series have said, are you going to cover dystopian narratives? Not only because that's my current journalism beat, but and yours too, technically.
Yeah, not on purpose, but join us as we describe the narratives that dominate our world. Okay, to understand dystopia, it's useful to understand where the word comes from. And conveniently, the word is a response to the word utopia, which comes from the Greek words for no and place. But the Greeks didn't actually use this word. Utopia is first introduced in the 1600s with Thomas More's book, Utopia, which we'll talk about later. In the 1800s, John Stuart Mill, making a case before Parliament denouncing the government's Irish land policy in England, raised the topic of dystopia for the first time, which literally just builds on the word utopia and adds the prefix dys, which means bad. So bad place. And his whole thing was that utopians are in favor of something that is so good it cannot be practiced, and dystopians are in favor of something that's so bad that it cannot be practiced. So the idea is to find a middle way. As Jess is about to go into, we've kind of run away with the idea of dystopia in the last couple hundred years.
Yes, we totally have. And to your point, for those of you not familiar with Thomas More and John Stuart Mill, Thomas More was a Catholic. Am I not mistaken here when I say that he was a devout Catholic?
Yes.
Yeah.
And actually, this relates to utopia itself and what makes that story itself so confusing, but we'll go into that later.
Yes, exactly. There's a lot of subtopics here. But overall, too, John Stuart Mill is the author of a prolific book called, essay, really. It was a long essay called On Liberty, which describes much of the ideas foundational to democracy nowadays. And many lawyers and scholars and government people see On Liberty as that cornerstone text to really get the ball rolling on what we have now. And also many ideas that we have about the internet. I've seen that book thrown into a lot of discussions about the internet, some dystopian discussions, mind you.
Definitely.
I think I actually talked about On Liberty in a piece about the darknet more recently. So these things do have what Angela's talking about, current applications to everything that we're interacting with today and the fears that have been stoked in us today as a result of these narratives in society. So first, what is a dystopian narrative? It's very similar to what Angela represented in the introduction here. And that is that it tells a story about an imaginary future that's an anti-utopia, often centered around centralized authoritarian control. That's usually what is represented in any kind of dystopian literature or depiction that we may have seen. And I want to bring up this point because there are many different versions of fears that are represented in dystopian narratives. So some of them that may sound familiar to you, the cornerstone one that I'm about to talk about from the last 100 years was torture and surveillance as a fear theme featured in George Orwell's 1984. There is organ harvesting in the Unwind series by Neil Shusterman, mandatory plastic surgery in the Uglies series. I don't know if any of you have heard of the Uglies series.
I know the Uglies series.
Angela knows this. Yes, probably a bit more than I do.
Unfortunately, yes.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
So we're looking at this being forced to make changes to one's body in these two examples. mind control in Lois Lowry's The Giver, right? And gender inequality, state-controlled reproduction, and religious fundamentalism in none other than the classic Margaret Atwood's The Handmaid's Tale. I know you know that one, Ange. Who doesn't?
Classic made for our times.
Exactly. And may I bring up the point that that book was written in 1985 and that Miss Atwood has told people that she wrote this book as a combination, a mosaic of dystopian ideas in society, everything from climate destruction to religious fundamentalism to gender inequality. So that one's has a special place in my heart of dystopian hearts. In Brave New World, there's control of human reproduction. So we're again at the center of this question about reproduction in Brave New World. Government arranged marriage in the Matched trilogy. And environmental disasters in the Maze Runner series. Are you familiar with the Maze Runner series? And yeah, James Dashner. And then finally, some of our listeners will probably be more familiar with this one, and that is A Man in the High Castle, which English title I always screw up because I watched it in German. But basically it postulates a different version of what would have happened in World War II's outcome if Germany had won and taken over most of the United States in a controlled sense, with Japan on the West Coast and them from east to about central. And so this is an example of a dystopian reimagination of history, which we see a lot in dystopian literature, a what if scenario, what would have happened if history had gone differently. So Ange, do you have any commentary about these? Because I've just named quite a lot of different series and pieces of literature that are very well known.
I love so much of what you're saying. I really sort of focused in on when you mentioned that a lot of dystopia tends to focus around a very authoritarian society. That's very interesting to me because I just finished David Graeber's The Dawn of Everything. I think, yeah, it's David Graeber and David Wengrow. It's two Davids, but I always remember Graeber. And basically, he makes the case for how we tend to think that we've been encouraged to think that our societies have been designed by default, like it was just the natural result of progress. But actually, cultures go up and down all the time. We'll never know what we lost in the Library of Alexandria. And this is in itself a kind of propaganda, this idea that we are the most advanced civilization that's ever existed. One of the cornerstones of the way that we understand statehood today is this idea that it is built on violence, the limiting of certain freedoms, and the subjugation of women. I don't have that all perfectly, but it's very charismatic leader sort of stuff. Like our entire sense of what a society is built around this idea that you are in some ways being controlled by an entity who limits your freedoms in ways that are arguably good, but didn't have to be that way. There were many ways that humans lived quite nicely before, and that seemed to rely a lot on the limitation of certain freedoms as well. So that so much of our modern understanding of dystopia just manifests as this nightmare of authoritarian control is really interesting to me. But one of the things that you and I were talking about before is also this idea that dystopia tends to be a reflection of not necessarily the future, but whatever it is we're having anxieties about right now and need to express. So, for example, in the period when there was a lot of anxiety about nuclear warfare, there was also a lot of weird sci-fi about alien invasions. There was that zombie craze a little while ago that seemed to be reflecting something about security in the context of statehood. There are a lot of things that vampires stand for at any given moment in time, our feelings about death, morality, etc. But to return to the idea of utopia for a second, and Thomas More, a lot of this seems to rest on this idea that things were better before. Like just behind dystopia is this belief that somewhere there's a utopia, or there has been one, or we could create one, instead of this much scarier place. And more in a really meaningful way, because what he was talking about in utopia wasn't really a perfect society in the sense that we understand it now. There are a lot of things that he raises in this satirical story that do seem perfect. There's no land ownership. Everybody keeps their doors unlocked. Priests can be men or women. There's religious freedom. You can have healthcare. You can have euthanasia. Anything that you need, you are given. Those things are nice, but there are also slaves who are pretty much all foreign. The women do all the housework. And for various reasons, everybody hates atheists. So there's a lot of debate about what utopia was a critique of. Was it monarchical policy? Was it land seizure, which was quite new at that time? Was it Catholicism itself? But as you mentioned, Thomas More was quite a staunch Catholic. So nobody really knows. It might have just been a compelling thought experiment in the same way that Jonathan Swift's A Modest Proposal, which was a very charming, straight-faced essay about the benefits of eating poor people's babies.
Charming and straight-faced is exactly the words I would have used to describe that Jonathan Swift essay. That is an incredibly powerful example of a satire, right? Also,
yeah, exactly.
A dystopian satire at that. Yeah,
a dystopian satire that functions to critique the way that the rich think about the poor. So nobody actually knows what Thomas More's utopia was actually critiquing, but it is understood that it was a critique of a constellation of things. So in this sense, his idea of utopia, his proposal of the idea of a utopia, which is not necessarily a perfect place, but a place that doesn't exist, is the same as what we understand dystopia to be today. It's a no place that reflects for us some anxieties about things that are going on right now.
And that brings up the exact central question, Ange, that I wanted to raise in this episode, and that is, why do we postulate about such a world? And you've managed to actually already answer some of those questions as to what brings this into our experience. Why would we waste our time? And especially if you're a believer in the doctrine of the law of attraction, for example, why would someone want to postulate about such a horrific future, like an authoritarian state-controlled 1984, for example, or this subjugation of women for reproductive status in The Handmaid's Tale? And the answer to that question also partially is because we've already lived many of these realities. Isn't that interesting? So it's not necessarily our imagination, right? Our unbridled imagination that's creating a world where unicorns are real. We've actually, I don't think anybody's ever really seen a unicorn, right? But reproductive subjugation, we see to this day in many societies. Even it exists right under our nose. We see environmental disaster. We see this plastic surgery. Of course, it's not government-controlled plastic surgery, but it is a societal idea that the more plastic surgery we have, the more beautiful we are, and therefore we can attain things. So we've kind of trained ourselves to do what they're talking about in the Uglies series. The organ harvesting that's going on as well, torture and surveillance, sure going on. So all of these things that I've named, like I said, not in our imagination. And I think we psychologically enjoy dystopias because we're taking ourselves to the worst possible scenario and training ourselves to accept that this could be our reality. That's at least one explanation I can offer to people. Again, I'm not a psychologist, so. So how did we get to become so obsessed with dystopias? And a fun fact that I want to present is Angela's pretty much an expert, or at least our resident expert, on mythology, which goes back centuries, right? I'm not sure how much our ancient ancestors spent postulating about so many dystopian outcomes, but I do know that in the last 100 years, the incidence of creating literature, particularly fiction and science fiction around this area of literature, is prevalent in the last 100 years. And this started coming into our fruition or in our existence after the First World War. Then you see 1984, the Orwell's book, which is highly referenced. In fact, in 2021, it ended up on Amazon's bestseller list. A book written so long ago, I believe 1949 was the year it was penned, or published at least. We're talking about not even 1950, right? 1949. And this book ends up on Amazon's bestseller list. Why? Because in the zeitgeist around us, this time period, we've got COVID misinformation abundantly out there. We've got election trolling happening on our social platforms. And why Orwell wrote 1984, and I want to go back to this, is that he was actually a journalist during the Second World War. So he witnessed a lot of what Hitler's version of Germany was back then, or was envisioned to be back then. And a lot of that thinking, although of course 1984 is not set in Germany, it's set in the UK, in fact, but he went back into his imagination from those experiences to create this book that does not end as a fairy tale whatsoever. There is love in the book, but we do see these people pulled apart. Spoiler alert, we do see these two central characters pulled apart by the end of the book in their love because they were weakened by the authoritarian state. But I want to bring something up. That's quite important. It's that in the 21st century, a researcher named Zeynep Tufekci brought this point up. And she says that the Orwellian view is now outdated for the 21st century, that given the events of recent years, and I'm talking since about 2015, the new dystopian narrative that we will probably start seeing a lot more. I think we've already seen this in books like Snow Crash, for example, and Ready Player One is another one about virtual reality. But what she says is that the new dystopian narrative is about artificial intelligence and technocrats controlling and manipulating us by silently judging and silently nudging us using our personal data about our behavior in directions not of our choosing until it's too late. And she says this in one of her TED Talks. I actually have a draft piece that I'm working on right now where I actually cite this TED Talk and those exact words. Spoiler alert there again. But I found this to be a fascinating view when I came upon this, because in many ways she's very right. We're used to seeing from 1984 the Orwellian approach of the central authority as being government, right? Not private sector technology companies. But in many ways, that's what's happening. And because that technology is there, we are seeing countries I know in Myanmar, this started a genocide. This has affected Ethiopia's civil conflicts. This has affected the drug wars in the Philippines. Ms. Reza, a Nobel Prize winner, coined the term patriotic trolling, where you were able to troll off people from platforms who disagreed with the president's views on the drug war and his approach to the drug war. So if there's any takeaway anybody has today, it's to open your eyes to this new version of dystopia, because we are living it on our mobile phones every day. And that's definitely something that I want to bring up. The other interesting piece that I found through a lot of research on this episode, yes, work does go into these, is that the number of books, shows, movies that have envisioned dystopia produced in the last 20 years envision the fall of the United States and North America. And my take on that, I'm sure Ange you'll have something to offer on this one, is that the US is our modern day Rome, right? It's our modern day contemporary empire. What stage it's at is, of course, debatable, but the Hunger Games, the Handmaid's Tale, the Man in the High Castle, all of these are postulating the end of what this idealism about the United States was supposed to be, and that it was a shining democracy for the rest of the world. And so it's interesting to me that we're not looking at other countries in these recent pop culture examples. We're looking specifically at one that these fears are being, the flames of these fears are being spread through this one ideology. But yes.
While you were speaking, I was thinking I had a new thought that I've never had about dystopia.
Please, go ahead.
Which is there's a world where dystopian fiction, dystopian stories, and I'll go into more of that in a minute, but there's a world where these stories exist, not necessarily us, but to prepare us. Not even because these things are going to happen or happening already, but because these things are eventualities that, because we're introduced to them, we can behave as if we live in a world where these are now possibilities. And maybe by just doing that, the story has an opportunity to be a different one. While we were doing research for this, I started thinking a lot about whether there are older stories in history that can be considered dystopias or that can be considered dystopian. Plato's allegory of Atlantis in 360 BC is, for a lot of people, evidence that Atlantis exists. Sometimes I think that, sometimes I'm not stoned, but
no judgment if you are.
Thank you. Actually, it functions quite gorgeously as a dystopian story that we would recognize today. You know, it's a story about a civilization that's technologically advanced beyond all of our imagining, that is wise beyond all of our imagining, but because of their arrogance, create their own destruction. In this case, a flood takes them. Most flood stories in our history, whether the story of like the biblical flood, which comes from the story of a Babylonian flood, there are many versions of flood story, but most flood stories in the long history of human storytelling they basically turn around this idea that mankind is too arrogant, so they need to be wiped out, right? In the New Testament of the Bible, the book of Revelation is also a kind of dystopian fiction. It's hard to pin for story, like for a book like Revelation, which was probably written down around the time of the time of the Babylonian captivity, but nobody really knows, and it was probably orally told before that. It's hard to know, but it's often attributed to this guy called John of Patmos, and it's basically a story about the end of the world. It's where we get the idea of apocalypse from, right? And apocalypse comes from the Greek, and it doesn't mean destruction. In fact, it comes from the term to uncover, to reveal something. There's something in there about sort of the prophetic revelation of a truth that comes as a result of our actions. This is important because this is moral. What I'm talking about is a moral attribute that a story is making, because that's a lot of what dystopias and even utopias are, right? Like they're a kind of moral reflection about our behavior today. There's this guy called Michael Witzel who tried to create a genealogy of mythology and storytelling. I might have talked about him before. He wrote this very great and very thick book called The Origins of the World's Mythologies. And basically what he does is he divides the types of mythologies and the flows of mythologies into a couple of families. And two of these families are circular storytelling societies. So this is a lot of the kinds of cultures that existed before literacy happened, because literacy was a huge disruptor that in a lot of ways contributed to the rise of the particular kind of statehood that we recognize today. That's a topic for another time. So you have circular storytelling cultures, and then you have linear storytelling cultures. There are some differences between these two cultures, and they also kind of overlap. One quality of circular storytelling cultures is that there is no story of the beginning of the world. There's no story of the end of the world. The universe just exists. You know, it existed before you. It will exist after you. There's usually a trickster figure who helps mankind. These are a couple of features of circular storytelling societies. Another feature of them is that in their storytelling, death happens, bad things happen, but there isn't really a moral attribute that's tied to these occurrences, or at least that's not the point of the story overall. These stories seem to make room for the idea that life is messy, and maybe if you didn't do the stupid thing that caused you to die, you wouldn't be reborn as this fresh entity who fulfills the prophecy that these other people had that you didn't even know about. You know, this is often the quality of a circular storytelling culture. Linear storytelling cultures, however, often in their mythology, the world is created, and at the end of it, the world ends. We come from an extremely linear storytelling culture in the sense that so much of our mythologies and also just the backbone of what we've built society on comes from Abrahamic religion, for example, and a lot of the hangovers of Abrahamic religion and a lot of just like the worldview of Abrahamic religion, to return to that topic of the book of Revelation. So dystopian fiction, for me at least, seems to come from a very clear logic of reward and consequence, which is very linear storytelling, right? You do the good thing, you live right, and you can imagine a good outcome, a utopic outcome. But if we collectively do the bad things the bad way, here's the shitty world that we all have to look forward to. So maybe if we just sort of like defang this idea of, you know, if you go on being bad, you're going to be punished, and welcome the possibility that living is messy and we don't know why people do the things they do or select policies they select, and there are ways that we can impact them and ways that we can't, but we can't control all of it. And definitely we cannot find a closure that satisfies everyone before our lives are older. The story is longer than that, right? Like maybe if we took both of these ideas of dystopia and utopia, like a vision that is both linear and circular, like every death is also a beginning. That's a huge quality of circular storytelling culture. We might find almost a dynamic middle way with which to orient our lives on a case-by-case basis that isn't instantly tomorrow it's vampires and everything is over. What do you think?
I love that. I love that, actually. I love what you said about the our moral compass, and many dystopias are a warning sign or reflection that we made decisions that brought us here. We made decisions that brought us to the point of no return. And now and in many cases, because they signify a central authoritarian control, a lot of that are warning bells to say, don't cede most of your power to this authority. Don't give away your power, which I think is also a powerful lesson, because many times throughout history, people are willingly enslaving themselves to things. They're willingly enslaving themselves to concepts. And this happens all over the world. They're willingly enslaving themselves to policies that hurt them. And for some reason, probably because of political narratives, which we will do an episode or 7 about, I think we need to do a season about political narratives, honestly. But we will actually cover that topic in future episodes, because there are many ways we can go with that. But these political narratives are so powerful that it convinces people that these things are good for them. And then the next thing you know, you end up with complete centralized control. And I think that was a lot of fears during COVID, is when we had lockdowns, when we had mandatory vaccines, especially in Europe. There was a lot of chatter and conversation about, are these mandatory vaccines causing a dystopian future? Are we forcing people to do something that could potentially be harmful to them? And then there was the other side of that narrative of, if we don't vaccinate, people are going to keep dying. It's the only way to help everyone. So whatever side you're standing on here, and of course, this is not a debate as to which one of those are true or not. It's just the narratives are so powerful that they convince people to do things they may otherwise not do. And that's how we end up in the end with these fictional tales of a dystopia in the end. One thing I do want to point out, and of the many things I've pointed out today, is that dystopian literature and stories and narratives glorify often a violent rebellion by a courageous few. So we see that formula and that framework present in these narratives, the violent rebellion by courageous few. And what I mean by that is, if you look at Hunger Games, you see this example. You don't necessarily see that so much with 1984. It was a bit of a more gentle, secretive rebellion, but it was unsuccessful in the end anyway, because our central character ended up completely manipulated and conceding to the state or the central authority's power. You also see that in Handmaid's Tale, right? You have Offred, or June, in Handmaid's Tale, who goes against the central authority herself and collects other people to join her in that quest. So we're seeing this hero's journey, as we talked about in another episode, this force of good and evil narrative construct present in dystopian narratives too, as a bit of a sub-narrative or storyline, if you will. I did research a study that I will cite in this, if you look at the links below this video, and in case you're joining us on a podcasting platform, I'm going to try my best to include it in the episode as well. If not, go to the page listed on the podcasting platform and I'll include it on that page. But there was a study done that shows that dystopian narratives affect people in a strong way to the point where they recalibrate their moral compass, helping them justify acts of violence that are normally deemed rebellious to that central authority, like I mentioned earlier. So overall, it appears that people might be more inclined to draw political life lessons from a narrative about an imaginary political world than actually fact-based reporting in the real world, because fact-based reporting in the real world, the needle on this rebellion is moving much slower than it actually is in fiction. In fiction, in a matter of 100 pages, central characters are going against this authority, and you're sitting there going, yes, defeat them. You know, you're sitting there cheering them on in this force of evil. Come on, defeat them. And in reality, it takes people a lot longer, or the backlash of them trying to do that is quite harsh in this real world. So dystopian narratives can also fast track violent political rhetoric. Very serious. Going back to what I said about the 21st century version of dystopian narrative, we have seen many examples of this that have been deadly. We've seen it in the United States, which is the country most dystopian novels are imagining the demise of, frankly, the destruction of democracy, the destruction of the notion of human freedoms. We have seen this in our election, of course, many times. In fact, my understanding is that Russian trolls were even interfering with the recent midterm as well, on Facebook, as they were before, or at least on some of the platforms. I need to look deeper into that to know which ones. But we've also seen this, like I mentioned earlier, in the Philippines, in Myanmar, in Ethiopia, all over the world. We've seen people being manipulated to vote for certain candidates based on advertising tools available in private sector tech company platforms. And so it's important to know that what you're seeing online is part of that dystopian narrative, that these very polarized pages you're visiting, no matter what side of the coin you're standing on here, there are polarized pages existing in every direction. And it's harder.
Yeah, they're end of the world stories.
100%. And they're harder and harder. And end of the world stories, the migrants are coming. They're going to destroy your country. End of the world.
The planet is dying. End of the world, literally.
Climate change. End of the world. Exactly. I love that. End of the world stories. So as opposed to civil and fact-based debate that is necessary for democracy to thrive, these extreme narratives can be so deadly and dangerous and incite the action in the wrong direction. So that's another reason, the social responsibility reason of why Angela and I wanted to present this episode, is that it's important to realize how influenced you are by these dystopian narratives. You don't have to read 1984. You don't have to watch The Handmaid's Tale to say that you've interacted with dystopia. It's everywhere. It's the technology that you use.
Definitely.
So you wonder how we could postulate such a world. We are that world. We are living it right now. Do you have anything else to add, Ange?
No, that's pretty cool. I would also hasten to say, I think one of the reasons why dystopia is so gripping to us, especially in these here times right now, is because we have a huge investment in and a huge anxiety about not the end of the world literally, but the end of humanity as we understand it in a really narrow context of what humanity is. The world, like life generally, does not have that kind of limitation. From an ecological, environmental, even from a scientific perspective, life is mostly interested in the diverse proliferation of other life, right? Which is sometimes that can be achieved in harmonious contexts, but sometimes that's also achieved in quite conflicting contexts, right? These two things are the natural result of interaction. Interaction can go either way. It's quite messy. So life is interested in diverse outcomes that can proliferate more in different kinds of life. We are mainly interested in proliferating a very narrow band of what we consider ourselves to be, however we're defining that. And I think on some level, there's a part of us that knows if our sense of self and what's important to the race at large remains this narrow, that is not a battle we will ever win, ever. because even if humanity continues on in the next few generations, we will inevitably change in ways that we can neither recognize nor control, not only as a function of what we've done, but of how our environments and the living world at large will have changed. And I think that this is something that we live very uneasily with. So as long as we don't address those feelings head on, like these aspects of, in order to have a different kind of life, there needs to be many kinds of deaths, you know, not only of our physical selves, but also of what we consider reality to be, or like, you know, our identities to be, whatever. Like, as long as we don't get comfortable with that idea, like this idea of cycles of death contributing to more fertile cycles of life, we're going to have these kinds of stories that terrify us into some kind of what we consider a consequent action. And it might be something that matters, or it might not, but it's also the arc that we're working against is much longer than our own lifetimes. And at the very least, that is something that we have to reckon with in order to make enduring progress, let's say, not only in our lives, but in terms of how we want to impact the world. Jess.
That's incredibly profound. I love that you just said that. If there's anything I would say in closing, it's that dystopian narratives offer us the lesson that radical political action is a legitimate response to a perceived injustice. But define radical here. Do we want violence? Do we want rebellion? Sometimes the rebellion is as simple as contacting a government representative, is as simple as doing a petition. Does it have to involve burning down storefronts and setting people's businesses on fire or cars on fire? No, it does not. It absolutely doesn't have to be that way. There are ways to change the trajectory of what otherwise is deemed dystopian than violence, I must say. And part of the flaw of this construct that is generated by this narrative is that these stories encourage that violence is the answer in many ways. They do. From time and time again. And it's not always the case, and it doesn't have to be the case. Sometimes maybe, yes, if you're defending yourself, but I would say it doesn't always have to be the case. I've always tried to fight injustice by changing policy, for example. And a lot of people have criticized me for not going out and protesting. And I say, well, if I'm too busy, you know, doing policy work to protest, then I'm actually changing things from the highest level I can get to. And that's been my quote unquote silent violence, if you will, against what I perceive as violence and injustices against women and other people. I should say those who identify as women, shall we say. Yes. Okay.
On the other side of that coin, some of the most violent dystopias are not physically violent toward their communities at all. Like, I'm reminded of just a basic notion of physics, right? Like, entropy is actually dynamic equilibrium. Like, you need these sorts of like chaotic forces in order to create an equilibrium over time. But order is something that requires force and energy in order to produce. It's not natural. It's not proportionate to nature. It's not the order that kind of pretends to be. It's not equilibrium, is what I'm saying. Equilibrium is always some aspect of dynamic movement. So I don't know. Like, I feel very sort of radically murky about this topic. But also, Jess, what is your favorite dystopia story?
I would have to go back to 1984. That's one of the most
Really?
powerful ones I have ever read. Yes. And I think it's because to me, it's wrapped up in so much of what we saw in the Second World War. And if I were to say a more contemporary one, it would be The Handmaid's Tale, which was still published in 1985. But as a person who is a gender equality diplomat in many ways, in one of my lives, I have many lives. But yeah, this one really hits home to me in many ways for the state-controlled reproduction. And that is something that has pains women over and over again throughout the centuries. And our ability to produce, which is a very beautiful feminine quality, is subjugated so horrifically and violently time and time again throughout history. Even going back to the Bible, you see instances of this happening. And in mythology, we see instances of this happening, which Angela has covered in other episodes as well. So I would say as a woman, that one hits home in a very scary way. 1984 for its involvement in history, and just because I'm a bit of an Orwell nerd and I know more about his other writings besides 1984, and I think he used the pen as a powerful satirical weapon and as a way to say what Germans would say, nie wieder, right? Never again. We never want to see this type of society again. What's yours?
I love that. Mine
Uglies? No.
Thanks. I mean, that was fun to read. My favorite is Emily St. John Mandel's Station 11. I almost don't even consider it dystopia. It feels like post-dystopia, the dystopian, well, the apocalyptic, let's say from a destruction standpoint, the thing has already happened. So it's everything that's happening after, and kind of a look at what caused this and why people are in the situation in the first place. And I find it sort of peaceful and beautiful and charming, even when I find it really fraught. And nested inside it is this other story that's more classically science fiction that somebody is reading out of a comic book, right? And I love this idea that even when the worst thing that can happen happens, like the worst thing, the system collapses, people, they find ways to organize. There are good people and there are bad people, but also there's this thirst for stories and there's this thirst for beauty, which is, it seems like a living principle. It just seems like it's something that's part of us. And this is something that I find really cool.
That's amazing. I love that. So in closing, I want to leave everyone with a verse from Thomas More, since we opened with Thomas More. This is a more naughty verse that steers a bit. It's not so dystopian, although at his time, this kind of verse could have been considered heresy and violation of the church and dystopian in that sense. But that's my favorite kind of dystopia. So, and also funny personal anecdote, I actually sent this to a boy that I liked in the 10th grade. I first learned this verse in the 10th grade, and I think I slipped him a note or something. And I can't remember if that was reciprocated or not, or unrequited.
Okay, let's find out what kind of creepy Valentine kid you were.
Yeah, shall we? I know. I promise everyone I've never stalked anyone in my life, not even on Facebook. Not even on Facebook/Meta. So that I'm not the unintended consequence you're looking for, shall I say. So the verse goes something like this. Let me see if I can remember it. I have learned from educated Paris that wishing and sin were one, that heaven punishes desire as much as if the sin were done. So if we're damned, then you and I are damned to our heart's content. Come now, let's enjoy some pleasure for our punishment.
Naughty baby Jess.
Yeah. 10th grade love. What can I say?
Yeah, that's giving sexy goth. That's giving.
And I love the resistance in it because he was a devout Catholic. So the thought of running off and pleasuring oneself in the woods with another person is rather sinful for his day. And there's something about that chic rebellion that I just love. Kind of like Dante Alighieri, one of my favorite Catholic church dissidents. Can you tell I was raised Catholic? I was. So until next time, then, thank you all for joining us. Really, it's been a pleasure. We love having you at our fireside chats about our dystopian future.
Have a gorgeously post-dystopian day.